The story kicks off at Darren Shan's funeral, where everyone is mourning his apparent loss. Surprisingly, it turns out Darren is not dead, but playing video games inside his coffin. The movie then flashes back to the past when Darren had a good life, popular, cool friends, and good grades. The only hiccup was his childhood friend Steve, who led him into trouble. One day, they decide to vandalize their history class and get caught by their teacher. Darren gets the worst of it when his ideal student image shatters, and his parents forbid him from being friends with Steve, calling him a bad influence. The next day, Darren tells Steve about his parents wanting to end their friendship, leading to a quarrel. A limousine passes by, throwing a flyer for a once-in-500-year circus called a freak show. Despite warnings about its illegality, they decide to attend. That night, they sneak out, revealing their peculiar interests. Darren loves spiders, and Steve is obsessed with vampires. They buy a ticket from a dwarf-like creature, but when Steve pays, the creature bites him and runs away. The boys don't pay much attention to the weird incident and enter the theater. The show attracts people of all ages, mostly adults and seniors. Mr. Tall, the host, thanks the audience and introduces various freaks. A wolfman terrifies everyone by tearing off a woman's hands, only for them to regenerate. Coral Limbs, who can regenerate body parts, is introduced, followed by Alexander Ribs, a man with no apparent ribs. Gertha Teeth can break anything with her strong teeth, and Rhombus Two Bellies can swallow and spit out a tricycle whole. Madame Truska invites Darren on stage but senses something forbidden and abruptly ends the show. Larton Crespley, with his spider partner Octa, performs a dance. Steve recognizes him as a vampire from a book and whispers to Darren about it. The show is interrupted by police, townspeople, and the boys' history teacher. While adults argue, Darren sneaks backstage and steals Octa. Larton appears with an old man, discussing the threat posed by a group of hybrid vampires known as the Vampanese. The confusion leaves the boys wondering what's happening. Suddenly, Steve bursts in, pleading to be turned into a vampire. He reveals a tough life. His father went missing, and his mother struggles with alcohol. After much convincing, Larton agrees to taste Steve's blood but realizes he's a bad person and refuses to turn him into a vampire. Angry, Steve storms off. Later, Larton discovers his missing spider, Octa, but before he can investigate, Darren panics and runs away. Darren ends up on the road, picked up by the same car as before, where two men, Merlot and Mr. Tiny, interrogate him. They realize they got the wrong person and drop Darren off at his house, promising to be in touch. The next day, Darren takes Octa to school, hoping to keep her safe. Steve sees them, plays with the spider, accidentally drops her, and chases her with harmful intent. Octa, fed up, bites Steve on the cheek, causing chaos in the school halls. In the aftermath, Steve falls and gets knocked unconscious due to the venom. Worried about Steve's life, Darren rushes back to the circus, begging Larton for help. Initially reluctant due to the risk of humans discovering vampires, Larton agrees to provide the antidote on the condition that Darren becomes his assistant vampire. This means leaving his family, friends, social life, and school. Essentially, he'll have to give up his current life and, in a sense, die. Despite the serious conditions, a desperate Darren agrees to Larton's terms and receives the vampire blood. They rush to the hospital to save Steve, and Larton successfully administers the antidote, saving Steve's life. A few days later, Darren begins experiencing the effects of the vampire blood, craving raw meat and feeling an irresistible urge to harm his sister. Choosing to restrain himself, Darren decides to leave home to protect his family. To spare his parents' constant worry, he opts to fake his death. With Larton's help, Darren simulates a fatal fall from the rooftop. The story then shifts to Darren's funeral, where everyone mourns his supposed demise. Inside the coffin, Darren is alive and well, playing games on his phone. Later that night, Larton digs up the grave, and just as they are about to leave, Merlot unexpectedly appears and attacks them. Fortunately, Larton fights him off, subduing him temporarily. After this close call, Larton takes Darren to the freak show campgrounds, where they meet a girl named Rebecca. Meanwhile, Steve, devastated by Darren's death, distances himself from society and becomes increasingly disturbed. One day, on the verge of doing something drastic, Mr. Tiny intervenes. Aware of Steve's troubled life and vampire obsession, Mr. Tiny offers him a chance to become a Vampanese. It's revealed that Tiny and Merlot are Vampanese, a different race of vampires who feed on humans. Vampanese and normal vampires, like Larton and the others, are arch-enemies with conflicting perspectives. Hearing the shocking revelation from Mr. Tiny, Steve is in disbelief but learns that Darren is alive and happy in another world, something Steve always dreamt of. Angry and without hesitation, Steve accepts Mr. Tiny's offer. Meanwhile, Darren settles into the freak show campground, training and helping others. Wanting to connect with Steve, Darren decides to call him, but Larton intervenes, snatching the phone and breaking it. That night, Mr. Tiny visits the freak show camp to discuss Darren's special powers. Despite being enemies, Mr. Tall diplomatically considers the request. Larton warns Darren not to leave the camp for safety and begins training him. Initially struggling, Darren's skills and strength improve over time. On the other hand, Merlot turns Steve into a Vampinese, giving him unreal powers. Steve becomes more evil, and his first victim is his history teacher. As Darren feels hungry for blood, Larton takes him to a nearby farm, sedates a man, and explains that vampires don't kill, they borrow blood. Despite the hunger, Darren can't bring himself to do it, and they return to the camp. Soon after, the peaceful freak show campground is suddenly attacked by a ruthless group of Vampinese, leading to a brutal fight and a lot of bloodshed. The Vampinese are searching for Darren and eventually find him hiding with Rebecca. An intense brawl ensues, but with the timely arrival of Larton, Mr. Tall, and other freaks, the fight is broken off, saving Darren from certain doom. However, it's revealed that Merlot has kidnapped Rebecca. The next morning, Darren, blaming himself for the incident, sets off to find Rebecca, while Mr. Tiny kidnaps Darren's family to lure him into a trap. Darren arrives at his empty home, finding a flyer inviting him to the circus. Larton also prepares to join the fight, gathering his weapons. Darren reaches the circus and finds Rebecca and his family tied up. Surprisingly, Steve is with the Vampinese. He attacks Steve, while Larton tussles with Merlot. Darren, weakened from not consuming blood, gets bruised easily, but Rebecca convinces him to drink her blood to regain strength. Reluctantly, Darren complies. Despite being badly wounded, Larton uses his last strength to stab Merlot in the heart, killing him. Darren continues to fight Steve. Mr. Tiny intervenes, resurrecting Merlot into a dwarf creature. He asks the boys to come with him. Intrigued by Mr. Tiny's power, Steve agrees, but Darren does not. After the showdown, Larton hypnotizes Darren's family to erase their recent memories of supernatural events. The movie concludes with Darren returning to the camp, warmly welcomed by all the freaks, making him feel at home.